Imagine someone hands you a root. It looks like food. It smells like food. You are starving. Your family is starving. And this thing grows everywhere. But eat it raw, and you will be dead within hours. Now imagine watching someone eat it anyway. That is not a hypothetical. That is the story of one of the most important crops in human history, and one of the most quietly terrifying foods on the planet, containing not a trace amount, but an actual lethal poison enough to kill a grown adult if eaten unprepared. And yet, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago, someone figured out how to make it safe. That process did not involve one step. It involved days of soaking, grating, pressing, fermenting, and then cooking, a sequence completed correctly in order across multiple days to remove the poison. That person did not have chemistry or a laboratory. They had desperation, observation, and something that turns out to be one of the most underestimated cognitive tools in human history: the willingness to keep trying something that had already killed people before. This is the story of one of the craziest survival choices our ancestors ever made, and why it was also one of the smartest. The plant world is not passive. Plants cannot run from predators, so over millions of years they developed a different strategy, using chemistry. They manufacture toxins inside their own tissues, bitter compounds, digestive disruptors, and outright poisons, specifically to discourage animals from eating them. For most of evolutionary history, that worked. Animals learned through pain and death which plants to avoid. But then humans came along. At some point, we started doing something no other species had done before. We started dismantling the plant defenses. The question is, how did anyone figure out that was even possible? Start with something most people have in their kitchen without a second thought, like kidney beans. Raw kidney beans contain a compound called phytohemagglutinin, a lectin that even in small doses causes severe vomiting and diarrhea. Just 5 raw kidney beans can put a healthy adult in medical distress. Boiling them for 10 minutes destroys the compound, making them safe and even nutritious. But here is the uncomfortable part. Before that knowledge existed, before anyone had worked out the cooking threshold, how did you know? Trial and error. Someone ate the raw bean, got sick, and died. Someone else noticed and tried heating it. Not enough heat and sick again. A little longer and sick again. Eventually, someone hit on the right duration at the right temperature, survived, and passed that knowledge on. That is not just courage. That is a proto-scientific method running on human suffering as its feedback loop. But kidney beans are simple compared to cassava. Cassava, also called yucca or manioc, is today a staple food for over 500 million people across Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. It is one of the most calorie-dense crops in the tropics. It grows in poor soil and survives droughts that kill other crops. In terms of raw caloric yield per acre in difficult conditions, almost nothing beats it. For people living in marginal environments, cassava is not a luxury. It is the difference between eating and not eating, and it is genuinely poisonous in its raw state. The poison in cassava comes from compounds called cyanogenic glycosides. When the plant is damaged, bitten, cut, or grated, enzymes activate, converting these compounds into hydrogen cyanide. It is the plant defense system triggered on contact, which means the more you process raw cassava without knowing what you are doing, the more cyanide you are releasing into the food. Traditional preparation methods that emerged in Brazil and West Africa involve grating the root, then wrapping the pulp in a woven tubular press called a tipoti and squeezing it for days to force out the cyanide-laden liquid, then fermenting, then drying, and then cooking. This process takes at minimum 4 days. Let that sit for a moment. Someone, somewhere, thousands of years ago, worked out a multi-step, multi-day sequence that required not just cooking a thing, but moving it through specific stages in a specific order to neutralize a poison that was invisible and became more active the more you worked with the raw material. How does a person even begin to discover that? Researchers have spent years wrestling with the detoxification problem, because the usual explanation of trial and error starts to break down when you look at multi-step processes. If eating the raw plant kills you fast, that is quick feedback. You learn not to eat the raw plant. But the connection between skipping step 3 and getting sick 4 days later is not obvious. The feedback loop is broken. Cause and effect are separated by time, by other variables, and by the noise of daily survival. So how did anyone ever figure out that skipping the pressing step was the problem? One theory is that the knowledge accumulated across many generations. No single person discovered the full process in one lifetime. People made marginal improvements each generation, refining the method and passing it on more explicitly, until eventually, the process worked reliably. In this view, no individual human was clever enough to design the detoxification sequence. The collective across centuries was. But there is a second theory. Certain traditional communities transmitted these methods so carefully, with strict taboos against skipping steps, and with ceremonial elements woven into the preparation itself, that the knowledge was protected against forgetting by design. The preparation of cassava in many indigenous cultures is not just cooking, it is ritual. And ritual in this context may have served an evolutionary function. It made it cognitively harder to skip the steps that kept you alive. You are not just making food while following a sacred sequence, keeping the cyanide from killing your children. The more you look at traditional foodways around the world, the more you realize this was not a rare accident. Detoxifying toxic plants was a recurring human behavior across cultures, across continents, and across deep time. Acorns, the nut of oak trees, contain tannins in concentrations high enough to damage kidneys with regular consumption. And yet, acorns fed entire civilizations. Indigenous peoples across North America and Europe developed leaching methods, cracking the acorns, grinding them to meal, then rinsing that meal through cold running water, sometimes for days, to draw out the tannins. The result is a bland, calorie-dense flour that stores well and can be baked into bread. Why go through all of that? Because in environments where grain crops were hard to grow, or in winters where stored food was survival itself, the caloric density of processed acorns was worth every hour of effort. Taro root, consumed across the Pacific, causes intense burning in the mouth and throat in its raw form from calcium oxalate crystals. Fermentation and cooking neutralize the crystals, and once someone had figured that out, taro became a staple across Hawaii and much of Polynesia. Bitter almonds carry their own cyanide compounds, which is why the sweet almonds we eat today are actually a rare genetic mutation, one of the few strains where that defense mechanism failed to develop. And then there is one of the most striking examples: lupin beans in the Mediterranean, which require days of soaking in running water to strip out alkaloids that cause serious toxicity. This knowledge is at least 3,000 years old. Communities in Sardinia documented elderly women as the sole living carriers of the correct preparation method. Communities that had lost that knowledge and tried to shortcut the process were getting sick again from a food their ancestors had eaten safely for millennia. The knowledge was not written down, it lived in people. And when those people were gone, so was the safety net. When we talk about early humans, there is a tendency to picture something reactive and instinct-driven, beings that move through the world responding to immediate threats, living moment to moment. But the evidence of traditional food processing tells a different story. To figure out if cassava is safe after 4 days of many careful steps, you need to be able to wait for days without giving up. You need something like a guess, seeing that changing the method changes the result. You need to teach these step-by-step steps to people who were not there when you found it out. And you need a group willing to trust that knowledge, even when it goes against what they see and feel right now. The raw cassava root looks like food and smells like food. The grated pulp sitting in its press for 4 days while liquid slowly drips out does not look like it is getting safer. Nothing about the steps feels like progress. You have to know the steps work and keep going. That is not simple thinking. That is planning. That is shared knowledge held by a group. That is something very close to science, without the tools and big words, but with the same basic shape of watch, guess, test, result, and pass it on. And here is what makes your skin tingle a little if you sit with it long enough. Every bit of that knowledge was paid for with lives. Long ago, people ate the wrong thing, got sick, and died, making it painfully clear that those around them had to pay attention. The built-up wisdom of old food making is a huge, unseen record of people trying and failing. Most of it was never written down. All of it is real. All of it was paid for at a price we can barely imagine. You eat this knowledge every day without knowing it.